Good evening, First Robotics community. My name is Sean Lim, and I'm the Director of District Implementation for First Robotics Canada. And welcome to another installment of our Ask the Experts webinar series. Today we're going to recap our one and only Week 7 event in the province of Ontario, namely the Ontario Provincial Championships. And on top of that, we're going to take a look at the final Ontario District Point rankings and give a little bit of insight on the teams that qualified for the World Championships and even some of those who might have just barely missed the cut. But this is going to be a really interesting webinar because, quite frankly, the Ontario Provincial Championships, well, they certainly exceeded my expectations. I knew going into them we were to expect a very, very high level of play, but quite honestly, I did not even expect what we were treated to over those few days this past weekend, where with the 60 best Ontario teams all in one place, something that we've never done before, the product on the field of what they were able to achieve was just absolutely incredible. And so joining us on the panel this evening, we've got a few members of the community who were present at the at the district championships. One of them is Mr. Kyle Laughton, who has been a field supervisor at actually a few of our events, but primarily at the brand new Western University event. He was also the assistant volunteer coordinator at the Durham College event as well. But Kyle, thanks very much for joining us. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Awesome, Kyle, and we're really glad to have you on with us. In addition to Kyle, we've got returning panelist, Matt Glanfield, and he is a mentor for Team 4039, Makeshift Robotics, out of Hamilton, Ontario. And Makeshift, in fact, did compete at the Ontario Provincial Championships. Matt, thanks for being here this evening. How are you doing tonight?
No problem, Sean. Just recovering from the event.
As I think many of us are in recovery mode. But to kick things off, I wanted to take a moment just to review the current qualification points scenario in the province of Ontario. And I'm going to flip over to our leaderboard, and scrolling right up to the top over here, we do indeed have our final points ranking for the province of Ontario. And for those of you who did have the opportunity to compete at the Ontario Provincial Championships, the points that the teams earned at the championships are worth triple the amount. And so the rankings did move quite a bit depending on the performance of, a few of the teams out there. But all in all, I don't think there's any major surprises in terms of who did qualify. But there might be a few interesting ones for some of the teams which may have just barely missed the cut. Teams which have traditionally been really strong over the past few years. But actually, I take that back. In terms of the teams that did qualify, there are a few in there who are somewhat newcomers to the scene here in Ontario. But I wanted to get some opinions from both Matt and Kyle on the district rankings and ultimately who did and did not end up qualifying out of the province of Ontario. But I'll swing this one over to Matt first. Matt, any comments, any surprises, both in terms of teams that did make it or teams that didn't make it out of Ontario to the World Championships?
There were a few. There were a couple teams that I'd seen at events that, really impressed me, and I was surprised didn't make it. But I think for the most part, it ended up about the way I thought. There's a huge representation of rookies, though, which is awesome to see.
Yeah, and scrolling down in terms of our rookies, like we're seeing 6378, Lynx, 6387, the Disco Bots, who both of those teams we've talked about quite a bit in terms of our previous webinars. We've also gotten the 31 and 32 spot, 6481 Deus Ex Machina and 6336 the Jabberwockies. So there are 4 rookie teams who qualified based on points, based on merit. So we're not talking about rookie all-star here and kind of winning the award and qualifying that way. These are rookie teams who came out fast out of the gate and just did better than the veterans in terms of the robot and awards and just, a definite over-representation. because there are actually now 5 rookies going to the World Championships. If we scroll down a little bit, we do have our Rookie All-Star Award winner, 63-31, and 5 out of the 33 teams, I think, that are on this list. That ratio is way, way, way higher than our overall number of rookies in Ontario. So that was really, really cool to see. And then maybe a special shout out to, they're not quite rookies, but they are a 6,000 series team, but 6009 Cyberheart, with a really, really strong showing at the district championships, earning 114 points. Now, this is a team that last week I think had a member ask about their passive gear manipulator, which they ultimately stuck with. I don't know if they improved upon it, but it looked like a pretty darn good passive gear manipulator at the district championships, and ended up captaining the 7th Alliance at the district championships, and ultimately upset the number 2 Alliance. And so a really neat story behind them for a very young team. But yeah, just adding on to Matt's point, this has been the year of the rookies and the younger teams. You know, they've definitely been overrepresented and have stepped out of their comfort zone, you know, doing really well in terms of earning those qualification points. Kyle, out of curiosity, any input on the Ontario district rankings as they stand? Any surprises in terms of who qualified, and maybe surprises in terms of who may not have?
For the most part, everyone who did qualify, there's not really too many surprises there. A lot of the teams that are up in the top 30 have always done fairly well. Our rookies, they have done amazing, the 4 that have qualified. Some surprises were like Team 1360 and 34th, where they just didn't qualify. They did fairly well at both their events, 34 and 32 points. And Max Tech, who was finalists at the Georgian College event, getting 58 points and not doing too bad at their first event. But with them not qualifying, that's a surprise there.
Yeah.
But for the most part, everyone that did qualify, there's not really too many surprises. They've all done really well over the entire season, very consistent, and that's what gets you onwards.
It definitely is, and I think the district model may have taught us that more so than any other year, where the consistency is something that's really going to be a huge factor, where if you aren't consistent in terms of both of your district events, that's seriously going to impede you from qualifying for the district championships in the first place. And then the district championships, excuse me, you want to have a good showing there, and it's a really good opportunity to move up substantially in the rankings because it's worth triple the amount. And you'll see teams just like 6009 take full advantage of that, where they knocked out 114 points just at the district championships alone to move themselves up in the rankings. But it kind of works both ways, where, you know, a team like Warp 7, for instance, they actually did not participate at all in the elimination rounds of the district champs, but they still end up qualifying because they actually had 2 pretty consistent showings in their district events earlier on in the year. And so some very interesting dynamics with the new district model on how to qualify, excuse me, where, you know, you can be rewarded for being super consistent in your district events, or if you're a little behind in the game, if you have a lights out showing at the district championships, you'll be able to move up in the rankings and pass a few other teams. So some interesting ones there. And like you mentioned, you know, a few teams which ended up just barely missing the cut, 1075. You'd already mentioned 1360. What's also interesting, there's a whole ton of rookies and young teams in this group who just missed the cut as well. Excuse me, but probably the more notable teams with 1075, 1360, and 4343, and 4001, another very well-established team that ended up just barely missing the cut by a handful of points. But in terms of the teams that did qualify, you know, I don't think there's any surprises out there. For those of us who've been keeping track and watching these teams carefully, when I look at these teams from 1 through 32, and I guess I should explain that. Some people are wondering why there are 32 teams on this list as opposed to only 29, which is what our allotment is for Ontario. it turns out that a few of these teams had also applied for waitlist spots at the World Championships. And so the waitlist process is totally separate from the points-based qualification. Waitlists are sort of this extra set of spots that First Headquarters is free to give out to teams based on things like how long it's been since they've been to championships. And so some teams had actually earned waitlist spots before they'd qualified based on points. And so those few teams which already had waitlist spots, their spots based on points actually don't disappear. They will actually get transferred down to the next highest point earning teams. And so based on these numbers, it looks like 1, 2, 3, and actually with our rookie all-star, it looks like there were 4 teams who had waitlist spots in our top few, and those spots have now been transferred down to the next few qualified teams. Oh, and I guess included in that would also be Team 1114, who is a Hall of Fame team, winners of the World Chairman's Award, which actually is part of winning that award, allows you to go to the World Championships every year. And so they had a guaranteed spot at the World Championships. And as such, they do not use one of our 29 points earning spots. And so their spot automatically goes to the next highest ranked team. So just some explanations there in terms of why there seems to be a few more teams qualifying out of Ontario rather than the 29 that many of you were expecting. All right, moving on. Many of you are looking at the St. Louis Northern World Championships and wondering, well, of our teams from Ontario who are going to be competing there, what divisions will they all end up being in? Because often we try and predict which teams will get a chance to get together on alliances. I'd like to just introduce you guys to one of a few different websites out there to help you keep track of when these divisions get released. It's a website called divisions.co, and if I go to it, it actually tells us that the Southern World Championships in Houston, the divisions are actually out, and there is a listing here if you click on them on which teams have been assigned to each of those divisions. But unfortunately, the St. Louis divisions, the ones that most of our Ontario teams will be interested in, they have not yet been released. And so you can either keep refreshing this page to see when they've been released, or you can sign up and get notified either with your email address or your phone number, depending on whether you'd like to be emailed or text messaged when the divisions are out. But this is kind of one of the more exciting things that happens in the FIRST community around this time, is trying to figure out, as soon as when divisions are released, figuring out which teams are grouped together and will get a chance to play with each other, and who might meet ultimately in the Einstein rounds. But I wanted to bring that website to your attention in case anyone is interested in keeping tabs on those divisions. And now I'd like to take a few moments with our panelists to maybe take a look at the statistics from the Blue Alliance for the Ontario Provincial Championships. And so we do this pretty much every week with our competitions, where we try and get a read for what the general trends were at these competitions. And I'll go ahead and pull up the Ontario Provincial Championships on the Blue Alliance, and I'll go ahead and flip over to the Insights page. But I'll send this one over to Kyle first. Kyle, just at a general level, you know, with the Ontario Provincial Championships, what were your thoughts? Would you be willing to give us just a little recap and tell us the story of what you saw at the championships?
For the time that I was there, which was Friday and Saturday, there was an outstanding amount of 4 rotors, a lot more than most of our qualifying events. As we can see, that's 60%, which is ridiculously high for an event. Most of the time we've seen it down in a 20%. But knowing all the teams that went here, that number is actually not as surprising as people would think. And even in eliminations, 70%, with 100% rotors, 1, 2, and 3 in eliminations is ridiculous. So all in all, it's not too surprising knowing that we have the 60 best teams in Ontario competing there.
Yeah, and I think the story behind those 4 rotors was that, you know, you pretty much expected them to go up every single match. That one and maybe both alliances would get it. Definitely one alliance in qualifications, not necessarily both. But once we hit the elimination rounds, you pretty much had the expectation that that there's a good chance both alliances were going to get that 4 rotors up. And when both alliances get those 4 rotors going, it begins to limit your options strategically in terms of scoring more points. And so I think that played a lot into the elimination round strategies that we saw. And maybe I'll swing this one over to Matt. Matt, in terms of the Ontario District Championships, what do these numbers mean to you? What's the story that's being told about the Ontario Provincial Championships in your mind?
Yeah, it means you have to 4 rotor or you're out. A lot less emphasis on climbing than other events, and a lot more on getting those gears onto the airship.
Yeah, and that pretty much became a requirement. I haven't done the statistics myself, but you pretty much had to 4 rotor or else you lost your match. And this is an interesting turn of events because in our prior weeks, in our webinars, we often talked about only doing 3 rotors and maybe relying on some shooting to get you past, the 40 kPa mark, and then maybe playing some defense. We really didn't see a whole lot of that at the Ontario District Championships just because the 4 rotors were so prevalent. And ultimately, I think what the question was being asked was, could you even effectively stop the 4 rotor, especially in the elimination rounds, and against some of these alliances that were constructed? I'm not sure if people felt that they legitimately could stop their opponents from getting 4 rotors, even if they played, 3 rotors, 40 kPa plus defense. But I'll swing that over to Kyle. Actually, I want to ask both of you guys generally that question. Did it feel like the 4 rotors could be stopped, at the Ontario District Championships? Kyle, in your opinion, what were your thoughts on 4 rotors and being able to stop them, or did they kind of seem inevitable if an alliance was constructed properly and if they really wanted it, there wasn't a whole lot you could do?
Yeah, there was definitely, it depends on the who is on your alliance. There are some alliances that just have 3 pure gear cyclers, like alliance number 3 and alliance number 4 at provincial championships. But just with those alliances, they have fairly good gear cyclers on both of them, and they were fairly hard to shut down. But there were some alliances that if you could get enough fuel and get 3 rotors, you could definitely try to shut down their alliance for getting that 4th rotor. But getting that 4th rotor is almost essential to win Ontario Champs.
Yeah. Matt, agree or disagree with Kyle on that one?
Yeah, I agree. And unless you're 2056, not only was doing 4 rotors essential, keeping other alliances from doing 4 rotors was going to be essential to winning as well.
Yeah, and I think that was another element of the strategy. Not only did you need to do the 4 rotors in order to win, you could have flipped that entire strategy on its head and said, well, we also need to prevent our opponents from getting the 4 rotors. And with some alliances, I think that was easier to do than others. And just reiterating Kyle's point, looking specifically at who was on alliances 3 and 4, because those were the 2 that Kyle had mentioned. For those of you in Ontario, like looking at alliance 4, Team Dave, which we know is a world-class cycler, Team 5406 Celtex. We also know, well, they're a lights-out autonomous shooter in addition to being an incredible gear cycler. And then 5024, maybe a team that not too many others outside of Ontario know about, but they were a super solid gear cycler as well. But basically, as soon as teleop started, you had 3 robots who on any given day could get you 5 gears in a match without too much difficulty. I'll be honest, if I was up against this alliance, I honestly don't know how you're stopping them, short of maybe taking a page out of Michigan's book, which I think that's a match we'll talk about later on. But with reasonable amounts of defense, I don't know if you're stopping that 4 rotor, honestly, and you may just be needing to outshoot them and try and get those four rotors along with them as opposed to trying to stop them, which was ultimately, I think, the strategy that ended up being employed by the number one alliance, who had to go up against some pretty strong, gearing alliances. But that number one alliance got 4 rotors pretty much every single match. And on top of that, also had to supplement it by getting the 40 kPa, leaning heavily on 2056's shooter. So in terms of the story that was played out at the Ontario District Championships, that was I'd say that was a pretty good summary. The 4 rotors was mandatory to winning. Stopping your opponents from getting 4 rotors, if you felt that was possible, was another key factor. But even then, you kind of expected that both alliances were going to get those 4 rotors. And once you got those 4 rotors, you needed to look for different ways to differentiate yourself. And in the case of the winning alliance, ultimately, it was 2056's shooting that ended up being that differentiating factor. So I think that takes care of our Blue Alliance and our insights from the Ontario District Championships or Ontario Provincial Championships. We did a pretty good recap there, but on top of just sort of telling the story and the stats, I wanted to ask you guys, excuse me, there were some things still at the Ontario Provincial Championships that I think might have been a little bit surprising or unexpected, but I'd like to swing this over to the 2 panelists again. But in terms of how it played out, were there any alliances that did better than you thought or not quite as good as you thought, or any different strategic plays that you saw that might have been a little bit, I don't know, different or interesting? Or I'll throw this one over to Matt. Was there anything out there that happened that caught your eye?
Yeah, I would put my own alliance forward in our strategy. It's kind of a cautionary tale. We, if you look at the quarters matchup between Alliance 4 and 5, both of them should have been easily capable of doing 4 rotors. Alliance 4 had some technical issues which kept them from doing it, but Alliance 5, I think we kind of killed ourselves with defense. We knew we had to stop their 4 rotors and put so much effort into playing defense that it actually kept us from doing 4 rotors as well. And we managed to get out of quarters, but we kind of did the same thing in semis too. Knew we had to play defense even harder against that number one alliance, and it really kept us from doing 4 rotors more than it kept them. So, you have to be careful with defense and how much you can commit to it.
Yeah. And again, there is that cautionary tale where you just mentioned overcommitting to defense so that you can't get the 4 rotors yourself. But if you undercommit to defense and you don't stop your opponents from getting, those 4 rotors, then your benefits of playing defense are kind of marginalized in the first place. So a very interesting cautionary tale, which, Matt, I think I want to delve upon that one just a little bit more.
Yep.
That's a strategy that for the past few weeks we've talked about on this webinar, and we were very much on the fence on whether it would be effective or not. So, I don't think anyone blames you for trying, but at the Ontario Provincial Championships, that's one competition where, against the alliances that you were up against, it may not have been as effective as you had thought. But here's the follow-up for you, Matt. At the World Championships, it's going to be a different set of robots. And the makeup of the alliances, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. They may not be as high caliber as the Ontario District Champs. You might agree or disagree with that. And as a result, does that strategy come back into play at the World Championships? What do you think? If you're going to the World Championships, do you think you might try that strategy again?
Yeah, so I think it depends very much on what division you're in. You can have stronger or weaker divisions, and those big teams like 2056 or those top shooters. If you have one of those in your division, your strategy might be different than if you don't. But I think with those types of teams, and you could expect one per division at St. Louis, it becomes kind of like mutually assured destruction if you go for fuel. And I'm of the opinion that I won't try to beat 2056 on fuel. They've already beaten me on it before we even start the match. And I'm going to do 4 rotors as fast and as easily as I can with my alliance makeup, and put as much time and effort into defense as I can to keep them from getting 4 rotors. Because without 4 rotors, it doesn't matter how much fuel they can do or how much fuel I can't do. I still win that match.
And I think you've got the right read on that alliance, because if you look at 2056, 610, and 4814 in terms of gear cycling potential, I would agree that there were other alliances at the Ontario District Champs who should have, could have, definitely did outgear them. It could put up gears at a much faster rate. And yeah, I mean that, getting your four rotors faster than the number one alliance and switching over to defense to try and stop them from getting their four rotors, it still seems like it's potentially viable. But unfortunately, we didn't get a chance to see that. The first alliance did end up winning, I think, all their matches on the way through and getting four rotors. But if you look at the sheer talent pool, on Alliance 1, 2056, they can gear, but it's pretty obvious to me and maybe to them that they want to be shooting instead. They're a lights-out shooter. They would much rather be doing that. That's probably how best they can help their team. If you ask them to gear, they can certainly do it, but I wouldn't consider them on the same caliber of gearing as basically anyone on the number 3 or 4 alliance. I'd say all 6 of those robots are superior gear robots in 2056. The rest of their alliance, though, 610 is pretty good gear cycler, maybe arguably one of the best in the province of Ontario. And 4814, they were pretty good support gear cycler, but again, now you're tipping the balance here where you only have 2 robots, one really good one decently good one, versus 3 really good robots dedicated to gearing. That's definitely an opportunity to take advantage of if you can find a way to tip that 4-rotor gearing advantage in your favor. So I even think at the World Championships, if you're trying to construct an alliance like this, let's say you get an elite level shooter like 2056, will they be able to get a super strong gear robot as their first pick, someone at the caliber of 610? Maybe, because 610 is pretty good, but maybe not. And then I'm a little worried about this pick over here, whether you're going to get someone who's even as strong as 4814 with the gears. You at the World Championships, you might have your elite shooters with not as much gearing support here, where they may fight a lot harder to get those 4 rotors up. So some defense strategies might come back into play there. Kyle, I'm going to swing that one over to you just very quickly as well. But in terms of the provincial championships, did you see anything that might have caught your eye that was, maybe a little unexpected or anything surprising?
What was surprising to me was that some of the high caliber teams like 865, 1325, 4343, that they didn't get picked into eliminations. They were all really good robots that could do a really good job. So just seeing that there were still some really good teams left over was definitely surprising. But it is the 60 best teams in Ontario, so there has to be a few left over, I guess.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that one, because I've never been to a competition in Ontario where a team like 865, who has been super strong at both gearing and shooting, that double threat, and who's basically, been alliance captains and made it far into both of their tournaments at district events, how they could not make an eliminations at an event here in Ontario. But even having said that, full credit to the teams that did make it. It's hard for me to see, any team here that I would have absolutely bumped 865 for. There's a few which maybe, were close and interchangeable, but I can't see, an obvious pick here that I would have 100% swapped them out for, no ifs, ands, or buts. But just it goes to show to the quality of the teams in Ontario and the depth that we had that 865 didn't make it, along with the other teams, 43-43 that you mentioned. I think there were some interesting ones in terms of gearing robots, those with intakes versus those who are loading from the slots. Matt, I think you mentioned something earlier about this in terms of some of the picks that happened, where it might have seemed some alliances went for robots with intakes versus those that didn't, and whether that ended up being a good choice or not. But Matt, did you mention something a little interesting about that?
Yeah, and I think I'm definitely in the minority here, and my buddies on 188 might think I'm definitely 100% wrong, but I think teams are definitely overvaluing floor pickups. You know, it really boosts their stats in qual matches when teams are dropping gears all over the place and they can pick them up and get those 5-foot cycles. But during elims, there's not many dropped gears. So that value kind of goes down. And regardless, when you're doing full court cycles with the floor pickup, most robots I've seen take longer to pick up a gear off of the floor in their loading station than robots with gear catches. So you're actually getting faster cycle times without a floor pickup. And you're just, you know, you're betting on your opponent making a mistake, which I never really feel comfortable doing. So I was kind of surprised to see, especially Alliance 2 and 3, so heavily weighted on those floor gear pickups over possibly, you know, debatably stronger gearbots.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because this was one that did come up really early on in our webinar series as well. You know, the value of a ground gear intake. And earlier on, it was super valuable, just like for all the reasons that you'd mentioned: drop gears, just being able to slam dunk them, stealing gears from your opponent because they would just be sliding them into the slots and they'd be falling out of robots and ending up on the floor, literally like 2-3 feet away from your airship. So again, the emphasis on them and their value might have been a lot higher earlier in the weeks. But as soon as we hit the district champs and the elimination rounds, that was really interesting to see, where it did appear that some of the intake robots, their cycle times were affected by the change in the game, where gears on the ground were just not as available. And there were a lot more balls on the ground too. So I noticed that when gears were put on the ground for the ground gear robots to pick up as they were doing their cycles, some of them struggled just to navigate through the defense, to get around robots, and through the balls as a result, in order to pick up those gears that were left out for them. So the number 2 alliance was a really interesting one, where they had you know, a lights out shooter in 11-14, and 2 traditionally lights out cyclers. Like, for leading up to this point, I probably would have said 188 and 2609 were 2 of the highest gears per match robots in the entire province. But how much of those statistics were because of taking advantage of dropped gears either by your opponent or by your opponents, and then those gears disappearing by the time the eliminations at Ontario Provincials came around? That might have been a pretty big factor. Although I do want to give a quick shout out to 188, because they were, I think, the only team at the district championships who successfully pulled off a 2-gear autonomous. And you know, Google it, find the videos on YouTube. It's really something else to see. They deliver a gear to the airship, and then they actually propped up a gear on one of their alliance partners, where the alliance partner kind of drives away and drops the gear on the floor for 188 to come back and pick it up, and then they score it. So 188 did qualify for the World Championships, and that's a really, really interesting one that I'd like to keep an eye on in terms of where that team takes that at the World Championships, because the 2-rotor autonomous made its appearance at the Ontario District Champs with some regularity. Looking at the insights here, you're going to see, you know, not so much in the qualification rounds, only 6 total. But here, 5 out of 30, we had, I think, 2 alliances which are capable of it. One which did it with some regularity, and the one that I felt did it with the most regularity was the finalist alliance, and they parlayed that 20-point advantage, you know, into barely missing out on beating that number 1 alliance in the finals. But basically, 4939, 4976, and 2200 all had incredible gearing potential. They were going to get those 4 rotors no matter what. And they had some incredible shooting potential at the same time, but not quite enough shooting potential to catch up with 2056. But they had the 2 rotor down, and that 20 points they used to their full advantage where with those extra 20 points, that extra 20 points in teleop works out to be 60 balls shot by 2056. And it's massive. And that was one of the big reasons they were able to get their scores as close as they did to the ultimate winners. But very impressive to see that two rotor auto happen. And it happened just barely often enough that I would like to say it's going to become something that the teams will be able to do. Especially if some of our Ontario teams pick up on that and a few of them get together. I think it's going to become a priority for a lot of our high-level gear robots. And it seems like Ontario has a higher percentage of really strong gear robots than maybe other areas. It's been a focus for us. And for those gear robots, they're running out of ways to score points. The 4 rotors is kind of the maximum that you're going to get just by scoring gears. And this came up in an earlier webinar with Parth Patel, the drive coach from 610. The next best way to squeeze out a few more points to try and catch up to those elite robots is to try and get that 2-rotor autonomous. And for really good gear scoring robots, it may not be as difficult as it seems, just putting together a solid autonomous to be able to score on one of those side pegs. All right, gentlemen. The next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about district championships versus world championships. We touched upon this a tiny little bit, but some of us think that there's going to be some differences in what we'll see at the world championships versus what we saw at the district championships, for better or for worse. But Kyle, maybe I'll send this one over to you. Do you foresee any big differences in gameplay or what to expect when our Ontario teams go down to the world championships?
Yeah. So with the World Championships, it's divided over 6 divisions. So that means all 33 Canadian teams that have qualified are going to be split over those 4 divisions. So we're going to be divided out 6 divisions. My bad. So not all of us are going to be together. As well as even an example of this would be Michigan State Championships. They were divided over 4 divisions. So we had all 60 teams competing together while they had all their teams divided over 4 divisions. So we'll definitely see a drop in the number of probably 4 rotors, even though there are a lot of good teams down in the States. But just from the Canadian side, that we're just going to be divided over those 6 divisions. So it's going to be kind of tough.
Yeah, I agree with that. Matt, on your side, do you see anything, else, or what do you see in terms of differences, if any, that we'll see down in the World Championships versus Ontario Champs?
I think the Ontario team's got a very nice preview of what World Champs might look like. I think the district champs were much more competitive, and that's excellent practice for any of the teams that are going to be finding themselves in St. Louis in the next week or so.
Yeah, because I think the strategies that we saw at the Ontario District Champs, if you can successfully play those same strategies at the World Champs, and based on what Kyle said, if you know that the talent pool there might be, maybe just a little bit lower, or I should say that the frequency of 4 rotors is going to be a little bit lower, our Ontario team should be able to use that to their advantage, assuming that they can, form the right alliances. And having said that, I'm also hoping that maybe a few of our Ontario teams can get together. And it's kind of nice because I think when we look at the teams that qualified, our Ontario team sort of at the quote-unquote lower end of the qualification rankings, these are all some really, really good robots there who, again, especially when we talk about cycling robots, and there's even, sprinkled in there some really good shooters like 1305. You know what? I'm gonna throw out a little shout out to them. 1305 is actually a pretty elite level shooter. It's just that they haven't quite gotten the recognition for it up here in Ontario. But this is definitely a team which the Ontario teams know about how good of a shooter these guys are. Excuse me, and especially when you're building 4-team alliances, and you want to just pat on another, massive autonomous shooter and even tele-op shooter, these guys would be a pretty neat option. But I'm also just going to tell a little story about these guys because there was a match at the Ontario District Championships that these guys played with 1114 and Team Dave, I want to say, yep. And when going through their strategy, they basically said this could be a 4 RP match because we can get both the 4 rotors and we can get the 40 kPa. And in this match, 1114, despite the fact that they're recognized worldwide as one of the elite level shooters in the world, didn't shoot a single ball that match. They basically said that 1305 could do the shooting, and 1305 did in autonomous and throughout teleop. 1305 easily got the 40 kPa solo on their own. And 1114 kind of just went on gear duty. And actually, this was, to me, I would have made the same call in terms of maximizing the strengths of all 3 of your robots. 1114 was a better gear robot than 1305. And actually, the harder challenge for that alliance would have been to get the 4 rotors. And so 1114 gearing alongside Dave to get the 4 rotors with 1305 shooting, that was pretty amazing. But I don't think too many people would have realized if they looked at that match with 1114, 1305, and 3683 Dave, and you saw the score in the 4 RP, probably 99% of the teams out there would never have guessed that 1114 didn't shoot a single shot that match. It was all 1305. So again, I think some of these Ontario teams, given the fact that we've got some really good teams out there and some of them are lesser known, I think there's going to be some steals to be had in the draft. And I don't want to call them buddy picks, but I think there might be a good reason for some Ontario teams to maybe pick each other just because they're taking advantage of the fact that they're not really known and that they may slide in the draft a little bit. And that might give them a little bit of an advantage, even just from being familiar with working with each other. So I don't know if that's going to play into it, but maybe one of the more interesting things, one of the more interesting storylines that may emerge out of World Champs. This might be a good year for us to try and assemble yet another A team. All right, and that pretty much covers the Ontario teams at World Champs. But and I think we did talk about the 2-rotor autonomous, although I didn't get a chance to ask my panelists about it. But I want to ask both of you guys: 2-rotor autonomous, is this going to be important or not really? Is this kind of fool's gold, too hard to do, or are we legitimately going to start seeing teams knock out these 2-rotor autonomouses and actually having them make a difference, being a deciding difference in some of the matches, especially at the World Champs in the elimination rounds? Kyle, what do you think? 2-rotor autonomous, important or not so much?
It really depends on who you're up against and how your alliance is put together. Because if you're up against a team that can do the 40 kPa in auto, doing the 2 rotors just breaks down that margin a little bit more. So there's definitely is a possibility for seeing a lot of 2-rotor autos. But it really depends on how your alliance is put together and who you're really up against.
Matt, how about for you? The 2-rotor autonomous going to be a factor or not really?
So, yeah, I thought it was pretty important this past weekend, but somebody actually pointed out that, if you have that KPA auto, as long as you score more than 20 points, that's worth more than delivering the 3 gears. So you would have a choice there between going for a KPA auto versus perfecting that 3 gears and relying on the human players. But I think it comes down to whether you're an alliance captain that has a side peg auto and is willing to make your first pick another side peg auto, or if you only have a center auto, and I don't know how likely it is that you'll get your first and second pick with side peg autos.
Yeah, unless you're specifically looking for it, just like you said, but you might be making some trade-offs by making those picks. So I think that's an interesting one.
Teleop gears is that 2-rotor autonomous worth, right?
Exactly. Well, for this one, I think it'll be a factor, kind of combining both of your answers, depending on who your alliance is. And I think maybe more so for, those 7th and 8th alliances, the ones who are later in the draft, because there are only so many elite level shooters in every division, especially now that we've got 2 world championships, we have 6 divisions. I don't think you're going to be able to put an elite level shooter on every single alliance in the eliminations. So, excuse me, I think if you're in those lower ranked alliance captains, or if you're one of those lower ranked alliance captains and you don't have access to an elite level shooter, I think you're going to go all in on gearing. And you may just say, okay, we're going to bank on this two-rotor autonomous and get the three most wicked, snarly, awesome gearing machines that we can possibly get. Bank on those extra 20 points from the two-rotor autonomous, get those four rotors as fast as possible, and shift it over into lockdown mode. And I think that's still a viable strategy at the World Championships, especially if you don't have that world-class shooter to be able to hang with, you know, the 2056s, 1114s, 254s of the world. But I still think it's a viable strategy. And I think that leads into maybe one video from a match in Michigan that I wanted to just spend a minute on because it ties into this two-rotor autonomous, because it ties into, you know, some of the more interesting strategies that we might see. But conversely, excuse me, at the Michigan State Championships, we saw a very interesting strategy that was way out there coming from one of the alliances with 107, 2337, and 5561. And this is kind of the opposite strategy to what I just talked about, where, you know, they do have an elite shooter, actually a super elite shooter in 2337. And how do we actually beat these four-rotor alliances? And this is, I guess, the converse, but we'll set this up very quickly. What we're going to see here is 2337's alliance will actually only get two rotors at the very beginning of the match, and then they will play shutdown defense and try and prevent the other team from getting four rotors. And actually, they prevent them from even getting three rotors, which is a little bit crazy. But if I hit play for this match, I'll skip forward a little bit, but we'll see 2337 is on the blue alliance in the bottom right-hand corner, just lighting up shots, and they open up the match, and they open up with a, you know, 30 to 23 kPa advantage. And this is where things get really interesting. The blue alliance, boom, right over here, you can see 5561, third member of the alliance, parks themselves right in front of the red alliance's lift. The other blue robot, 107, you can't see it here because they're blocked by the airship, but you can see a little bit of blue up here. That robot is on the other side of the airship, parked in front of the other lift. So the blue alliance is denying 2 out of the 3 lifts for the red alliance. And as I play this, you'll see red robots coming here saying, hey, I want to get to my lift. I've got a gear, trying to get in there. And 5561 just stays there, blocking the lift. And the red robot just rams them repeatedly, trying to free him up, but nope, no access there. And so the red alliance is now limited to only one lift the entire, well, I won't say the entire match, but through the majority of the match. And while this is going on the blue alliance, 2337 in the bottom right-hand corner is just happily picking up balls and shooting them into the boiler and widening their KPA advantage as big as they possibly can. And at the stage, you're seeing blue start to pull away. And they do this. 2 blue robots just parked there in front of the lifts. And you'll see by the end of the match, if I scroll forward, the red alliance just does not deliver enough gears. And they're stuck at 2 rotors. And right up until the end of the match, here's where things get interesting. The blue alliance had a 52 to 34 advantage on KPA. Both of them were stuck at 2 rotors, so the red alliance could not get that third rotor with 2 of their lifts blocked. And the only reason why red ends up winning this match is because blue, unfortunately, misses a climb. If blue had gotten this third climb, they actually would have successfully won this match, which is a little bit crazy. But this is the alliance, sorry, the red alliance that ended up winning this match. This was the eventual Michigan State Championship winning alliance. And so it's a little crazy that, yeah, they were nearly taken out by this simply crazy strategy. And so I'm going to swing this strategy over to our 2 panelists here. This was very, very different in terms of gameplay compared to what we saw in Ontario. And this strategy would have been successful with that climb, But I'll swing this one over to Kyle first. Kyle, what are your thoughts on this strategy? Do you think there's a place for it? Well, first of all, do you think there was a place for it here in Ontario? Would this have worked? And secondly, do you think this one could crop up at the World Championships?
Well, I believe that this strategy, if it was implemented properly in Ontario, it might have worked. The likelihood of it actually working was not high, maybe within 10%, maybe even. But it's just because a lot of the Ontario teams can cycle gears really fast. In this video, the Blue Alliance left with 40 seconds left. And there are definitely Ontario teams that can cycle at least twice within that time to get that third rotor to push you ahead. And even with shutting it down to only one lift, that does give options. So for your other two robots to one of them do gear cycles, or two of them do gear cycles, and one can do shooting. So definitely in Ontario, I believe that this probably it could work, but only with the right alliance. And but the likelihood of it happening would be very, very minimal.
Yeah, Matt, what are your thoughts on this strategy? A little out there, but I think you've got some pretty strong opinions about this one too.
Yeah, I generally agree with Kyle that in Ontario, this strategy, both alliances would have gotten 3 rotors 100% of the time. Neither would have gotten to 4, but both would have gotten 3. So it would work for some teams, like Alliance 8 at the Champs could have tried this with 1305 shooting the whole match. I think they would have had a good shot at, well, I guess not beating 2056, but almost any other alliance just on fuel alone after 3 rotors. But yeah, I mean, it's a gamble. Any of these crazy defense strats, and there's a couple more I'm still waiting to see teams brave enough to try, but yeah, it's a gamble, and if you have to take it, I'd love to see more teams do something like this instead of just the same old things.
Yeah, I agree. I love seeing teams try this, especially when you're in desperation mode. And this was hardly an attempt at desperation because they nearly pulled this one out. This was in Michigan a totally viable strategy, but in Ontario, I think it's a different matter because the big thing when I look at the strategy in Ontario is that we have at Ontario District Champs, I want to say that there was probably a team on nearly every alliance that could literally solo 3 rotors in gear delivery just by themselves. And so, having said that, if you left one lift open and that alliance just had only one team gearing, they probably still should have gotten 3 rotors, and 3 rotors would have been, more than the difference to be able to break this strategy. But on top of that, the other 2 red robots here, one of them really should have just been shooting the entire time, which, on most of our alliances, we did have a capable enough shooter that they could have just continued to shoot. And then that third robot, the one that's not gearing and not, doing the solo 3 gears, probably would have been playing defense on 2337, which would have made things a lot more difficult for them. Because there's 2 things I want to point out in this match. Because the blockade, or rather the 2 blue robots that are up there, I'm just going back to the point in time when they leave the airship. So the counter's at 55. If I hit play, excuse me, 55, 61, and 107 drive away from the airship with 49 seconds left in the match. If that happens in Ontario, and you open up these lifts and there's 49 seconds left, I'm sorry, but the Red Alliance doesn't get stuck at 2 rotors here. With 49 seconds left in the match, if you open up your 2 lifts at this point, you're getting three rotors pretty much 100% of the time in Ontario. Like that is not happening, and that pretty much breaks the strategy right there. I'm actually not sure why Red was still not able to finish up their gears at this stage with that much time remaining. But maybe they were rattled at that point and just couldn't get their gearing back in gear. but I want to say that the level of gears in Ontario would not have allowed that to happen, and for this match to have been that close. So
yeah, I also real quick would just like to say that I think there are probably somewhere between 6 and 10 teams at the district champs that if you limited them to only one peg for the entire match, I think they could still get 4 rotors. And I'd love to see it at Worlds if some of those teams end up in the same division, maybe a practice match. I'd love to see if they could do it.
I wonder if someone artificially in a practice match might just say, hey, let's try that and see what happens. At that point, I think your limiting factor becomes your pilot, because you've still got to bring that lift up and down and drop it, and that takes a certain amount of time. But that's a really, really, really interesting one. I would love to see that happen. I would probably, that would be a really interesting prop bet. That would be a really interesting prop bet for World Champs coming up. But
yeah, unfortunately, Dave and our team didn't get a chance to do this, but we really wanted to see who could score the most KPA, make shifts, midline high goal shot, or Dave's low goal.
Just for an entire practice match. That would be pretty hilarious. All right, but that was a pretty interesting match. We'll see if I don't know if that exact strategy is going to emerge at the World Championships, but there's some similar variations on that one that we might see, in terms of defending the lifts and basically trying to stop the 4 rotors. I think those we'll see a lot more of, not necessarily this specific type of execution, but that'll be really interesting to see. And so speaking of World Championship strategies, 3 rotors in defense, I think that's one that becomes viable again at the World Championships. Especially if you've got, this is probably the strategy I would have liked to have seen that Blue Alliance play. I actually think that would have been more successful, but a part of me wonders whether they felt that they didn't have enough gearing talent, I guess, with their 2 other blue robots to be able to get 3 rotors first. And that becomes interesting, because if you took, 2 of our Ontario teams who were gear specialists to support 2337, I bet you could have done 3 rotors in D in almost the same amount of time, and even held those teams out longer for, instead of calling them back at 49 seconds, I bet you could have left them out for much longer. So a 3 in D approach, similar to that one, I think is a little bit more viable at the World Championships. But at the World Championships, I think what we're going to see more is 4 rotors, fuel, and maybe the 2 rotor Auton, but I guess that's something that I'm waiting with excitement to see exactly which strategies end up coming to the surface out there. There's a few minutes left in the webinar, and I wouldn't mind spending some time taking some questions from the audience. And so if you have any, please do go ahead and open up those chat boxes and ask them. It's a good opportunity to get some input from Kyle and Matt and even myself on how these World Championships might play out, or even if you had some questions about the Ontario teams and how they performed over the course of the season. But please go ahead and ask those questions. But we do have one question from Andrew Champ. And his question is, what strategies will be used to win Worlds? Will the strategies be different at Houston and St. Louis? All right. And so let's tackle that first one first. What strategies will be used to win Worlds? What's the winning strategy going to be? And is it going to be different at Houston versus St. Louis? Kyle, I'm going to throw that one to you first. What do you think the winning strategy is going to be?
In my eyes, I feel like you got to try to get your 4 rotors as fast as you can, because that extra 100 points is very crucial in an elimination match. It can make up for a possible missed hang, and if you all hang on top of that, right there, just with that alone, the 4 rotors and the 3 hangs is into the 350 point value, 400. So that will almost win most of the matches that we've seen. And then after that, just once you get your 4 rotors, just try to play as much defense as you can. Shut down the other team from trying to get that 4 defense and getting that extra 100 points. So if you can do that, then you have a pretty good shot at winning Worlds.
Matt, how about for you? Well, what do you think the winning strategy is going to be at the World Championships?
I expect to see the best fuel bot in each division, essentially ranking first and picking the best gear bot they can, and then whatever they can pick up on the way back up. And I think that will be a very winning combo for just about any division. But I think if you're not one of those two teams, then you have your next best shot is getting all the best gear bots you can and trying to beat them to 4 rotors by 20 or 30 seconds and playing as much D as you can to keep them from getting there.
Yeah, I would have to agree probably with both of you guys on that one. And, for Matt's last comment, where if you're trying to do that second alliance where the best gear bots that you can, I don't think we're going to see alliances like that quite beat the more traditional alliance with the best fuel bot picked or partnered up with the best gear bot that you can. I think that combination is a little difficult to beat, mostly because your best fuel bot is also still going to have some gearing potential. But where things get interesting is your best gear bot. Is it going to be at all important, or even like your third pick, who's probably going to be doing gears? Is there any importance in terms of having, another fuel bot on your team to be able to shoot, some support fuel or additional fuel, or is that totally redundant at this level of play at this point? So Kyle, what do you think? Do you see any importance in having, more than one robot shooting fuel at this stage?
I mean, it really depends on how the divisions are set up. If there's like a lot of very good shooters in each division, then getting that extra shooter and getting those extra shots could really help. But it is all really more dependent on how the divisions are set up and what teams are where.
Yeah, Matt, how do you feel in terms of the importance of having possibly more than one shooter on your alliance?
Yeah, I think if a team like 610 was paired up with 2 strong shooters, they could overcome the best fuel bot, at St. Louis, as if they were the only shooter on their alliance, but only if they can prevent the other alliance from getting to 4 rotors. So for me, I think it comes down to defense, and as long as your strategy gives you enough resources to commit to the defense you need to keep the other alliance from doing what they want to do, then yeah, I think you could win with 2 fuel bots.
Yeah, but you still probably need a good number of gear potential, enough to get the 4 rotors in any way, shape, or form. So very interesting, for sure. Which might lead into, well, actually, let's answer the second part of the question, which is, will the strategies be different at Houston and St. Louis? I'll chime in on this one. I think the winning strategies at both Houston and St. Louis are going to be pretty similar. I think the winning strategy ultimately is going to be, best fuel bot with the best gear bot, and then another really good gear bot. Excuse me, and they're going to get the 4 rotors and get the 40 kPa bonus as much as they possibly can in autonomous, and then work towards getting the 4 rotor first primarily, and maybe picking up some fuel and shooting it in an opportunistic manner, but still focusing on the 4 rotors first. And then once they're done the 4 rotors, any robots that can shoot will just continue to shoot. Any robots that can't shoot will at that point just start playing defense. And that seems to be the formula for getting, those really high 500 plus scores and still being able to react and resist, all these other interesting strategies which are coming up. But they're all contingent on getting the 4 rotors as fast as you possibly can, or as many rotors as you can as fast as you possibly can, and doing it faster than your opponents. I don't think that strategy, I think the winning strategy is going to be roughly based around that. It'll be the same at both Houston and St. Louis. What will be different, though, is in the elimination rounds, how many alternate strategies we see different alliances playing to try and beat that strategy. And I think in Houston, I have this feeling that we'll see maybe a few more alternate strategies, such as, the one that Matt mentioned, where you load up on as many gears or gear robots as you can, or maybe something crazier where you load up on more shooters, or something out of the Michigan State Championships that we just saw there. But ultimately, I still feel that the winning strategy is still going to be more or less based on best fuel robot getting together with the best gear bot with another really good gear bot. Excuse me. Matt, and do you think Houston and St. Louis, the winning strategies will be different between the two, or any differences?
I don't think so, but it is interesting that St. Louis gets a chance to watch Houston and see what worked and what didn't, and adapt before they ever have to play a match.
Yeah, that is really interesting.
I
Kyle,
don't know if that's an advantage or a disadvantage. I guess it depends what team you are.
Yeah, and it depends if something really crazy strategically comes out of Houston as well, which could throw a monkey wrench into everything. Kyle, do you think there's going to be any differences between Houston and St. Louis strategy-wise?
No, not really. Basically, just their winning strategy is going to be probably very similar. But the one thing is that all of the Michigan teams and Ontario teams do get to compete at St. Louis, and we do get to see Houston compete first and see what works, what doesn't work, and if there are any weird strategies out there that actually do work, then we can even put them into play or even adapt and make them better than what we saw down in Houston.
Yeah. We have another question from Steve Williamson, and Steve's question is, was no one surprised that 11-14 was out in the quarters? I was really surprised to see them out in the quarters because looking at their numbers and who they got on their alliance, it basically mimicked the exact strategy that we just talked about, winning the World Championships, where you get the best fuel bot, you pair it up with the best gear bot, and then you find another really, really good gear bot. And that formula fit that alliance to a T. Like 11-14, still arguably one of the best shooters in the world, especially in autonomous. Maybe the one downside is the fact that they lack a ground pickup, but if you watched how they operate very carefully, especially in late game situations, taking advantage of the recycling slot for loading fuel and how they can just dump straight from that and get one last load of fuel scored at the end of the game. Strategically super savvy. Really, really unexpected, but I still haven't had a chance to talk to really anyone from that alliance after watching the elimination rounds, because I saw some interesting things happening strategically in that in those quarterfinals, which I didn't quite maybe understand at the time, and maybe still don't. But with 188 and 2609 on your alliance, I would have thought that they would have knocked out the 4 rotors super quickly, just cycling gears back and forth. But that didn't happen. And even with 2609's role in one of their matches, I'm not sure if it was a malfunction with a robot or what the story was behind it, but I saw them in a match where they ran around playing it appeared to be playing a lot of defense and also picking up fuel off the ground and just storing it in their robot. And I don't think that's really ever been a part of their game. So I don't know if there were some interesting things trying to be done strategically there that didn't quite pan out, or if there was an actual robot failure. But yeah, that one was very surprising. But having said that, seeing who they were up against, so here's the irony of the situation. They were up against Alliance 7, which was 6009, 1241, and 4678, who I think I played a much, much more straightforward strategy, where 6009, just gears like crazy with a super simple robot that, they actually didn't have too many more options than that other than just to do gears. 1241 could do a little bit of support shooting, but I think they were leaned much more heavily on to do some gearing as well. But this alliance just played a much, much more straightforward, simpler strategy and executed it, I guess, just a little bit better to knock out the number 2 alliance. Matt, any commentary on that? It was definitely an upset. I don't think too many people, inside or outside of Ontario, would have looked at the composition of these 2 alliances and basically said that Alliance 7 is probably going to beat Alliance 2, because I certainly had in my bracket Alliance 2 as favorites in that matchup.
Yep. Alliance 2 had some big names, 11-14, 188, and Beaverworks had a very good showing at their first couple events, but for some reason at the District Champs, they weren't doing nearly as well as people, myself included, expected them to do. And 188 even seemed like they were having an off day, at least on a Saturday. And then that Alliance 7, you have some numbers that maybe people don't recognize, 6009 especially, but even Cybercavs are relatively not well known. And 1241 had a, compared to last year at least, a bit of a weaker year. But none of those teams are bad at all. And coming into the district champs, they were some of the best teams there. So 6009 has a very basic robot, but I don't think I've ever seen them do less than 4 gears. They climb every match and they get an auto gear. So Alliance 7 was smart enough to know that if they got the 4 rotors every match, they could beat Alliance 2, even with fuel.
Yep.
And Alliance 2 just, for whatever reason, wasn't quite able to pull out the 4 rotors in 2 of their matches, and that knocked them out.
Agreed.
Or at least in 1 of their matches.
Yeah. Kyle, how about you? Was that quarterfinal matchup between 2 and 7, was that pretty surprising to you too?
Yeah, I was actually very surprised on that one. Alliance number 2, to me, looked like they were almost guaranteed the winner against that pairing of 2 versus 7. But Alliance 7 did get the 2 rotors fairly often. To get them closer to that 4 rotors, 4678 Cybercabs, they had a ground pickup which was fairly consistent and worked most of the time. So it was definitely going to be a close match, and they definitely were fairly close. It went to 3. So I was definitely surprised to see Alliance 7 pull it off and take out Alliance number 2.
Yeah, they definitely were some very close matches going to 3, and only a handful of points separating them in all 3 of those matches. But yeah, I guess that kind of goes to show that even the best laid plans, and even on paper, if your alliances are really well constructed, you still got to play the matches. We have another question from Parth Patel, and his question is, would you agree that this game comes down to perfection? You can be the best cycler, shooter, or hybrid robot, but every missed hang or wrong call can be super costly. Ontario Champ finalists were 3 balls from winning finals 2. Yeah, I mean, this from early on in the season, it's really been a game of mistakes, and at the lowest level, the first mistake you got to work out is your climbs, right? Basically, if you miss a climb, you're done, just because they're so high value. So that whole concept of a game of perfection and not making mistakes was established pretty early on. But for the most part, once we've hit the higher levels of play, the climbs were sorted out, and then the next mistake that I think you make is, to me, it feels like the inability to hit a rotor and autonomous. You got to at least deliver 1. That was kind of a problem earlier on in the weeks, but that seems to have worked itself out. And then, the next mistake was getting 3 rotors. If you didn't do that, you were going to lose. And we've basically hit the point now in the game where the next mistake is if you can't hit your 4 rotors, you're not going to be able to do that or to win. And some would argue that maybe at the highest level of the game, the last mistake is not hitting your 40 kPa. But Ontario Champ finalists were 3 balls from winning finals 2. So there were, it was a 9-point difference. So I guess it was a little more than 3 balls from winning finals 2. But I guess
if I can actually chime in on that, they actually had 39 kPa. So 3 balls would have got them the 20 points, which actually would have put them ahead of Alliance number 1 and would have won them that match.
Would have won in the match. You're absolutely right. So thanks for pointing that out there, Kyle. And that's a little crazy. And that's where they didn't score 2 rotors in autonomous here. They just, they really just, excuse me, I'm trying to see how they got that point differential. They were awarded 25.
Tech fell.
there was a blue zone tech foul that would have put them up and over. So that's kind of an interesting one for sure. But you could say that that also would have played a factor into not making mistakes, where that tech foul was definitely a mistake. And, I guess that's one that I don't think teams have totally sorted out yet, especially in Ontario, because if I look at the stats for the Ontario District Championships compared to the Michigan District Championships, if we go to our insights, in our playoffs, our average foul points were almost up at 12, whereas in Michigan, they were playing cleaner matches with their average fouls down at 8. And actually in Ontario, it actually hasn't been that bad. The district champs were some of the worst in terms of penalties by, a fair margin. We had some competitions where they were more down in like the 3-4 points range. So that was also an interesting one to kind of look at. But yeah, mistakes for sure. For this game, it really is coming down to a game of perfection. Which is nice, because I'd rather you lose on mistakes rather than sheer luck, which has been the case in some other games. If you make a mistake, this is going to sound pretty harsh, but you probably deserve to lose a match. And if you lose a match because you made a mistake, that's probably something you can live with a little more rather than some random occurrence. We have a few more questions before we wrap things up, but the next question is from Soeb Nadim, and he's just wondering what are our thoughts on Alliance 6's picks. And let's take a look at Alliance 6's picks. I'm not sure if we have any thoughts on that one, but we'll see after we take a look at the Alliance. So Soeb, you are actually from 5036, and you have 4917 and 4476. Yeah, I personally really like those picks. But maybe I'll let one of the other panelists take the first crack at this one. But Kyle, maybe I'll swing this one over to you. 5036, 4917, 4476. To me, that fits one of the strategies that we've been talking about quite a bit, like pretty much to a T. But with a little bit more than that, maybe with 4917's shooting capability. But Kyle, what are your thoughts on Alliance 6's picks?
Yeah, I kind of see exactly where they were going with for the picks. They were pretty smart. Both 5036 and 4476 did gears fairly well. They both had fairly good pilots that knew exactly how to do it and how to work well together. And then 4917, another good gear cycling robot that had the capability of shooting to get those tiebreaker points if need be. So in my eyes, it was a pretty good matchup and a pretty good pairing to be a pretty good contender against some of the alliances.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the picks that were around this area, what your other options are and who they chose, like 4917 in terms of all these picks that I guess, 7 and 8 would have had the opportunity to pick. 4917 might have been your best cycler available. And I say this from Windsor because in Windsor they were pretty lights out when they were partnered up with 610 to be able to win that competition against, arguably some better shooting alliances. Probably better than most of them on that were ultimately picked in between up until Waffles. Maybe with the exception of 4678 because they had a ground intake. But 4917 also had the added ability of having a pretty good autonomous shooting, and if need be, even tele-op shooting on top of that with a ground intake. So that's definitely a pick that I definitely easily could have made out of that slot as well. And then Waffles, yeah, these guys flew under the radar a little bit because they had a lot of robot issues at District Champs, so they flew under the radar just a little bit. But if your scouts have been keeping track of them, you would have known that they basically opened up their Robo Rio and found a whole bunch of metal shavings inside of it, cleaned it out, and that was causing their Robo Rio communications issues, and were basically 100% back up and running just before elimination started. And these guys basically all year long have been really, really strong gear cyclists, but they are also particularly talented strategians and defense robots. So I like this. I liked exactly where 5036 went with this alliance because you very easily could have played the all-out four-rotor strategy and just raced to those four rotors and shut down and played defense. Or on top of that, you could have, well, you also would have gotten some KPA out of 4917 doing that in autonomous, so that would have been a nice bonus on top of that. And even then, 4917, after you switched over to defense, you had the option to have them continue to shoot and top up just a little bit more KPA just to put you over the top. And that nice little detail actually ended up being important, not necessarily for the number 6 alliance, but you'll actually see for the number 1 alliance. We alluded to it a little earlier, whether it's nice to have a second shooter or not. 610 has not been known for doing any kind of shooting all season long, and rightfully so because they're not really a volume shooter. But in pretty much all of their matches, they were taking opportunistic shots. Every time they dropped off a gear at the airship, as they were dropping off the gear, they took a few pot shots at the boiler and made a handful of them. You could say that they put in enough points, and even in auto, they would hit a good number of their 10 preloads. And between their shooting contributions, as marginal as they were, and they were marginal compared to 2056's shots, but you could argue that they made up that 9-point difference that was the ultimate deciding factor in a match like Finals 2, just by taking those opportunistic shots to bump up just a few extra KPA. So very, very interesting one there. 5036. I don't think you're going to have anyone on this panel saying that there were some strange picks, or maybe they might have looked at a different robot. But no, I think the only notable thing is that there were no ground gear robots at this stage, but based on Matt's commentary about the importance of ground intakes at the district championships, I would not have batted an eyelash at that at all whatsoever. Matt, any comments on the Alliance 6 composition here?
What you said about Waffles was entirely true. They're kind of a sleeper pick. They underperformed in quals because of robot issues, but I think had 5036 not picked them and they had gone higher in the list, it could have been dangerous. They had a very, very, very consistent side peg auto and could do a good number of gears in matches. So that was a very good pick to identify and to pick up. I don't know. I guess maybe he's looking for advice on what he could have done better or what actually he did do very well. But
now that you mentioned the side peg auto, I actually don't know if 4476 or 4917 had a side peg auto, and that might have been the only thing to look at, was if you had two with the side peg auto, you could have taken advantage of the two-rotor autonomous. And I'm just going to skim down. Did these guys ever hit a two-rotor autonomous in the elims? Because unfortunately, I think these guys were eliminated in 2 straight matches in quarters.
Looks like they did.
4.
At least in one
they
of
did.
them.
So they did hit the two-rotor there. So yeah, I think that was really well constructed, because that two-rotor autonomous, I would say for that alliance, was definitely something they would have needed in order to sort of hang with in order to hang with the rest of the alliances. And they'll see that the alliance they ultimately ended up losing to also hit the two-rotor autonomous, which kind of sucks in that regard because they were able to match them in that one match. But yeah, I don't think any concerns from our end on how they could have constructed that. But yeah, I think they focused on the 4-rotor strategy, two-rotor autonomous, doing it as quickly as possible, and maybe switching over to some defense. And
Yep.
I like that. I think that was a good approach, and the chips probably didn't quite fall the way they were hoping. I think they probably felt they easily could have won that first match as opposed to losing it, considering it was only decided by 10. But those 10 were likely because of fuel points in autonomous, because when you're up against 4976, and I'm just going to take a look at that. No, there was only one fuel from the red in the high. It was during tele-op where they shot 44 more fuel. Yeah, that's the tough part. That would have been the difference maker in the match right there. Yeah, and that's a tough one, but there would have needed to have been the ability to switch over in that match to stop those guys from getting the 4th rotor But again, in Ontario, that's still a question that maybe is still in the open, whether it's even possible to stop that many quality Ontario teams from getting that fourth rotor. So I think it was a valiant effort, and I see no concerns with how that alliance was constructed at all. I think there's just one last question before we wrap it up, but we have a question from Thomas Johnston, and he asks, if 610 declined, who do you think 2056 would have picked? Seeing as 1114 and 2056 are both gear scorers, who would be the next option? Oh, that's a very interesting hypothetical question. So we're now putting words into 2056's mouth, because obviously we're not them, but that's a very interesting hypothetical scenario. So we've got a world-class lights-out shooting robot like 2056, and let's say who we feel is the next best, or who the best gear robot in 610 declines us. Who would our next pick have been? Interesting hypothetical. Maybe I'll throw this one to you, Kyle, first. That's a really interesting one, because I think a lot of people were surprised, maybe people outside of Ontario, that 2056 didn't pick 1114, because that's a partnership that in the past has been super, super successful. But a lot of us in Ontario who'd watched those robots very closely kind of felt that had they picked each other, that actually would have been more surprising, because as far as the strategic game is concerned, they may not have been the best fit for each other, especially when it came to getting the four rotors, because the four rotors were basically nearly guaranteed at the Ontario District Champs, and those two together would have been challenged. I think I'm saying that quite honestly, would have been challenged to get the four rotors, because they would have been taken away from their strengths, which really would have been shooting. But Kyle, if you were 2056 and say 610 declines you, who do you pick?
I mean, it's really a preference on how you would want to play your strategy. Do you want to do completely lights out shooting, like pick 1114 and both of you cycle balls? They take from the hopper, and 2056 takes the miss shots, whatever left on the ground, and cycle gears for most of the match, and at the end kind of shoot. Or would you try to get another team that can do gears really well and try to get basically another 610 robot? But one of them that I would probably be looking at would be Rebels 4976, picked up by Alliance number 3. They were a pretty good gear cycler, and they did also have a pretty good shot as well, so they'd be a pretty good fit for them. Even 4939, they're a really good gear bot as well. Won 3 district events and made it to finals, so that kind of says something right there.
Matt, how about from your standpoint? You're 2056 and you're looking to pick up your robot, assuming 610 declines now and they're not available.
Yep. I think I'm going to go with an answer that everybody's going to hate, but I don't think it really matters. Looking at the scouting data, I think the next 10 or 15 robots did, essentially the same number of gears. And that's what 2056 is looking for, just how many gears can you do? And there's 10, 15 robots that all do the same number, and you pick any of those 10 or 15, and I think 2056 still could have won it. So, pick your favorite number, I guess, or your favorite color.
Well, that is an interesting one, because they only did win Finals 2 by 9 points. I think that was a much tighter margin than some of us were imagining, especially since 4976, 4939, and 2200 aren't exactly as big of names as 2056 or even 610. People outside of Ontario might have looked at that and said, oh, well, they shouldn't even be getting close, but they most certainly did. But in terms of any other robot, I'm going to play the devil's advocate here, because I'm going to look at 1114's pick, who technically was in that exact same type of position, and they chose to pick 180. Yep. And over the course of the season, I mean, I haven't done the numbers, but this is just purely hypothetical out there. Would 188's gears per match numbers have basically justified them as a pick to be the next best gear, robot in Ontario? Quite possibly, actually, because they were absolutely lights out, in McMaster, which ironically, they didn't win either, unfortunately. But, Matt's point about slot loading robots versus ground pickup robots plays into a factor, maybe in my guess here, where if 610 had declined, would I have picked 188? Maybe. I might have leaned more towards Kyle's pick in 49.76, ever so slightly, just because there's something, excuse me, really attractive about hitting that 40 kPa in autonomous mode, and maximizing the autonomous mode where those balls are basically triple the value. And this is the unknown here, where I don't know if 49.76 and 11.14 both have, a close hopper and a far hopper autonomous, where, they can basically both go to different hoppers and hit them at the same time and do double shooting. I think if there was one, I would have gone with 49.76, and the same thing goes for 20.56, and that would have been a great opportunity to maybe do that, and still picked up a really good gear cycling robot, because Rebels are in this interesting spot where they are also a really good gear scoring robot. So maybe that would have been one dynamic that I would have taken a good long hard look at, but that's also really interesting. If not the Rebels, my next pick after that probably would have been 49.39, and maybe I would have stuck 188 right after that as well. But some of that's dependent on whether there was a possibility to do a double shooting autonomous with 2056 and 49.76, because that would have made things even more interesting. Let's just say that much. And 2056 and 610 kind of took advantage of that. 610 shot their preloads, and they got pretty close to hitting the 40 kPa in autonomous each time. But if 2056 and 49.76 could have gotten together and they both could have done a hopper autonomous, I pretty much would guarantee that they hit 40 kPa in autonomous every single match. And that would have made things interesting for the remainder of the match. And that's it. That's all we've got for questions from the audience. So I wanted to take a moment to thank everyone for being on the webinar with us, and wishing everyone who is competing at the World Championships all the best. Unfortunately, I will not be able to attend the World Championships this year, but I'll be cheering you guys on from Ontario on the webinar, and watching very, very closely how things unfold there. But we do have one final webinar, which is the season wrap-up, where we will be able to give some final thoughts on how the season went, and that will actually be on May 1st. And so we don't have a webinar next week. I'm sorry, there's a little typo here. It's actually going to be a few weeks from now on May 1st, where we'll give our final thoughts, and we'll even give you a little bit of insight on some of our upcoming off-season events and what to look out for those. But I wanted to take a moment also to thank our panelists, both Kyle Laughton and Matt Glanfield, for joining us this evening. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for your time and your talents and your expertise. We really appreciate it. Some really great insight on how this game has unfolded here in Ontario, and how we expect our Ontario teams to do. But have a great night, everyone, and we will see you on May 1st. Take care.